David Carter sat at the head of the sleek conference table, his fingers steepled in front of him, a posture that conveyed calm assurance. The room was filled with the low murmur of conversations as the morning meeting began to wind down. The glass walls of his corner office in the Carter Innovations headquarters overlooked the city skyline, a perfect metaphor for his position in the tech world, elevated, but always vulnerable to the forces below. At 42, David had achieved what many would consider the pinnacle of success. He had founded Carter Innovations a decade ago, a company that had grown into a global leader in artificial intelligence and machine learning. His innovations had shaped entire industries, from healthcare to finance, earning him accolades and attention from around the world. Yet, despite the success, David never fully embraced the label of visionary that others placed on him. He was a quiet leader, one who preferred to guide with sharp intellect and thoughtful action rather than loud declarations. His reputation had earned him the admiration of his team, young engineers, developers, and researchers who thrived under his steady direction. To them, David was more than just a CEO, he was a mentor and a source of inspiration. His leadership style was measured and deliberate. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried weight. David didn't need to dominate a room to command attention. He led by example, by focusing on the work and always holding himself to the highest standard. But in the world of venture capital, boardrooms, and high-powered investors, the rules were different. David had learned early on that the corporate world was a place where appearances mattered just as much as results. For every accolade he received, there was a whisper of doubt, a second glance, a quick assessment based on something other than his qualifications. David was black in an industry that was still overwhelmingly white. His technical prowess and business acumen were often dismissed or undervalued, and while he had learned to navigate the subtler forms of racism with the grace of someone who had become accustomed to the struggle, it didn't make the reality any easier. Every day was a balancing act, building his company to new heights while constantly proving that he deserved to be in the room. It wore on him, bit by bit. It was a fact of life he had long since accepted, but that didn't make it any less painful. Today, David had a meeting with a new group of investors, a chance to secure more capital to further expand Carter Innovations. On paper, the meeting should have been a routine business transaction. David had long ago become accustomed to the high-stakes nature of these discussions, always poised and composed, keeping his emotions in check. But today felt different. Today, there was a new investor joining the discussion, Victor King, a wealthy businessman with a reputation for his elitism and sharp tongue. As David made his way into the meeting room, his thoughts briefly flashed to the previous day's prep meeting with his team. Everything was in order. The product demos were solid. The projections for the next quarter were promising. But the tension was palpable. The investors always showed up in polished suits, exuding confidence, often with a sense of entitlement. There was always that subtle undercurrent, the unspoken assumption that a black man couldn't possibly lead a company like Carter Innovations. David adjusted his tie as he entered the room, greeting his colleagues with a nod before taking his place at the head of the table. He could feel the eyes of the room on him. But he didn't flinch. He never did. Instead, he exuded a quiet strength and aura of assurance that made it clear to anyone paying attention that David Carter was no figurehead. He was the real deal. As the meeting progressed, David navigated the conversations with ease, guiding the discussions toward the points that mattered. He answered questions about the company's trajectory, responded to concerns, and led the room with the same precision he always did. But then, Victor King arrived. Victor was a man of sharp suits, shiny shoes, and an air of condescension that practically radiated from him. The others greeted him with the obligatory handshakes, but when Victor reached David, he did something that made the entire room fall into a tense silence. Without a word, Victor extended his hand, but only to the other investors and board members. He looked David up and down, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips, then nodded curtly before turning to the rest of the room. David's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression neutral. It wasn't an outright insult, nothing that could be quantified or immediately acted upon, but the dismissive nature of Victor's gesture hit him like a punch to the gut. It was the kind of subtle, insidious racism that David had become all too familiar with over the years. Victor hadn't assumed David was the CEO, he had assumed David was someone's assistant, or perhaps a junior analyst, a cog in the machine, but not the one steering it. David extended his hand to shake Victor's, but Victor had already turned his attention to another board member, leaving David to retract his hand slowly, feeling a sting of humiliation that he had no outlet for. He had been in enough high-stakes meetings to know that this moment, this slight, would be a quiet one, unnoticed by most, but its weight would linger long after. A deep breath. It was a small moment, yes, but the insult, though unspoken, was unmistakable. David kept his focus, pressing on with the meeting, not allowing the incident to derail him. He would rise above it, as he always did. But the frustration gnawed at him, and the longer the conversation dragged on, the harder it became to ignore. He could see the subtle glances exchanged between the other investors, the way their expressions shifted when they realized how powerful a presence David was, too powerful to be dismissed. The meeting finally adjourned, but not before David had made his final pitch. His words were measured, concise, and when he finished, he could feel the shift in the room. The investors were no longer just listening, they were nodding, they were agreeing. Victor King had sat through the entire meeting, his earlier disdain now replaced with grudging respect. But none of that could undo the slight from earlier. The sting lingered. David took a long walk back to his office afterward, his mind racing. This wasn't the first time he had been underestimated or dismissed because of his race, but it was always the moments like these, the small, quiet ones, that left the deepest scars. They were harder to fight, harder to call out, but they were the ones that chipped away at his soul. He had built Carter Innovations with grit, determination, and an unwavering belief in his vision. But no matter how many breakthroughs he led the company to, no matter how many accolades he received, the struggle to be fully seen and respected was a constant undercurrent in his life. David sat at his desk, looking out over the city. He had a legacy to build, a future to secure for his company, for his family, and for the community he had always worked so hard to support. But today, the fight felt especially hard. He could already hear the quiet voices in his head, questioning whether the victory was worth the cost of carrying so much weight. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm orange glow across the horizon, David took a deep breath. The world had yet to fully see him, but that would change. One step at a time, one project at a time, one breakthrough at a time. He wasn't just going to rise above the challenges, he was going to make sure they were impossible to ignore. He wasn't just a CEO. He was the future. And one day, the world would recognize that. David stood outside the glass conference room, watching the city's skyline stretch out beneath him, the sun beginning its descent behind towering skyscrapers. The meeting had ended nearly an hour ago, but his mind hadn't stopped. He could still feel the weight of Victor's words, the dismissive tone that had slipped from his lips like poison. The encounter had shaken him, more than he cared to admit. He'd told himself to brush it off, just another arrogant executive who didn't know him. But it wasn't that simple. The words Victor had spoken, the way he'd treated David like just another employee, a cog in the wheel. It kept replaying in his mind. He could still hear it. "We'll handle the details. You focus on the numbers." David clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He had worked years to get to this point. His achievements were not the result of luck, or privilege, or simply being in the right place at the right time. He had earned his seat at the table, and yet, here he was still being treated like an outsider. David had always been aware of the challenges of being a black man in the business world. He'd grown up hearing about the extra hurdles, the systemic barriers that his father had to navigate, and the stories of others who had faced similar discrimination. But he had never felt it so directly, at least not this blatantly. Not until Victor. It wasn't just the words themselves that stung, but the broader implications of what had happened. David wasn't naive, he knew how the system worked. The corporate world was full of victors, people who wielded their power like a weapon, who believed that their position in the hierarchy gave them the right to diminish anyone they saw as beneath them. But what if he was wrong? What if this wasn't just an isolated incident? What if this was how it had always been? How many others like Victor had underestimated me over the years? David wondered, staring at his reflection in the glass. How many times have I been overlooked, my work dismissed, simply because of who I am? He had worked his way up in the company through sheer determination and skill, but moments like this made him wonder if it had ever really mattered. He had always kept his head down, his focus on the work, believing that his success would speak for itself. But now, as he replayed the events of the meeting, David couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth, that maybe, in some spaces, it wasn't enough to just be good at what you did. It wasn't enough to be excellent, to push through, to rise above. Sometimes, the people around you would still see you as less than. David's internal struggle was like a constant war between two sides of himself. On one hand, he was driven by the desire to be seen for his accomplishments, to gain the respect he deserved. On the other hand, he feared becoming too vocal, too outspoken, worried that it would mark him as difficult, that it might damage the reputation he'd worked so hard to build. For a moment, he felt trapped, like there was no way to win. Victor's voice echoed in his mind again, dripping with condescension. "We'll handle the details." David shook his head, taking a deep breath. He couldn't let it go. Not this time. He had been through too much to let someone like Victor define his worth. No one had the right to make him feel small. It was time to remind everyone in that room, Victor included, who he really was. The next morning, David arrived at the office early, before anyone else had a chance to settle in. The building was still quiet, the usual hum of activity just beginning to take shape. His assistant, Rachel, had already left the morning briefing on his desk, along with a few reports that he needed to review before the next phase of negotiations. David took a seat at his desk, the cool morning light streaming through the windows as he pulled up the file. But his mind wasn't on the reports. It was on the meeting yesterday, the way Victor had belittled him, and the nagging feeling that there was more to prove. More to show. No more hiding, he thought. He wasn't going to play small anymore. Not for anyone. For the first time in a long while, he let the frustration simmer into a determination. It wasn't about revenge or anger, it was about asserting himself. About making sure no one would ever underestimate him again. He had worked too hard to let someone like Victor trample on his success. David opened his laptop and started planning. The upcoming negotiations with Victor and the investors were crucial. The stakes were high, and David knew that if he wanted to truly lead, he had to be assertive more than he had ever been before. As he clicked through the documents and set up his strategy, he thought about the moments in his life when he had felt underestimated. In school, in early jobs, and especially now, at the peak of his career. He had always been the one to rise above, to stay quiet and let his work speak for itself. But now, he realized, it wasn't enough to be quiet. His silence had been mistaken for weakness. His calm demeanor had been interpreted as a lack of ambition. No more, he thought. I'm going to make sure they know who I am. David sat back in his chair, eyes scanning the numbers on his screen. He began mapping out how he could take control of the meeting, how to assert his position without overstepping, but also without being pushed down. He would speak with authority, but he would also listen. He wasn't going to fall into the trap of becoming combative or overly defensive. But this time, his voice would be heard. Victor wouldn't be able to ignore him. Not anymore. As the days leading up to the meeting passed, David felt a shift within himself. It was as though he were preparing for something bigger than just a business negotiation. He was preparing to confront the way the corporate world viewed him, and the way he viewed himself. It wasn't just about winning this deal, it was about proving something to himself. When the day of the negotiations arrived, David walked into the conference room with his head held high. The usual team was there, including Rachel and a few of the investors who would be making key decisions. Victor was already seated at the table, reviewing a few documents, his face still as smug and self-assured as ever. David took his seat at the head of the table, his back straight, his posture unwavering. His gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Victor, who barely acknowledged him. It didn't matter. David knew what he had to do. As the meeting started, he jumped right into the numbers, presenting his strategy with confidence. He was calm, composed, but assertive. Every word he spoke was deliberate, every decision backed by years of experience and knowledge. He could see the investors' interest peaked, their eyes focused on him now. Victor, who had been trying to dominate the conversation, was slowly being sidelined. Every time he interrupted, David met his gaze, unflinching, and guided the conversation back to the points that mattered. It wasn't about proving he was right, it was about showing that he belonged there. That he had earned his place. By the end of the meeting, the tables had turned. Victor had been forced to listen as David expertly navigated the negotiations, steering them in a direction that benefited everyone at the table except Victor. As the meeting concluded, David stood, his confidence now undeniable. He had made his point not just to Victor, but to everyone in the room. He wasn't just another executive. He was a leader, and he wasn't going to let anyone forget it. As he left the conference room, he felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt in control of his future. And that, more than anything, was worth fighting for. This chapter delves into David's internal conflict, his growth, and how he navigates the challenges of asserting his authority. Would you like to further explore any specific moments or themes in this chapter? The morning after the meeting, the tension at Carter Innovations hung thick in the air like smoke. As employees filtered into the office, the whispers started almost immediately. The confrontation between David and Victor had been a spectacle, one that had left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. David sat at his desk, pretending to focus on the pile of reports in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to the meeting. The look on Victor's face as he belittled David in front of the board, the way his colleagues had exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react, these moments played on repeat in his mind. David had expected resistance from Victor, but the open hostility had caught him off guard. It wasn't just about business anymore, it was personal. And that was what scared David most, the realization that Victor had never seen him as an equal. To Victor, David was still just the young, ambitious upstart trying to make a name for himself in a world that wasn't built for people like him. David had spent his career proving that he belonged here. His work, his ideas, his drive, all of it had brought him this far. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. The board meeting that would determine the future of Carter Innovations loomed just weeks away, and everything David had worked for was on the line. If he couldn't rally enough support, if he couldn't convince the board that he was the one to lead the company forward, then Victor's influence would be the one that prevailed. As the day went on, it became clear that the fallout from the meeting had already spread through the office like wildfire. Some of David's team had rallied behind him, offering quiet words of encouragement, but others remained cautious, unsure of which way the wind would blow. Corporate loyalty, after all, was a fragile thing. No one wanted to be caught in the crossfire of a power struggle. Even the employees who had always respected David seemed to hesitate now, as if waiting for someone to take the first step. David knew he couldn't afford to be passive. He needed to take charge, to show everyone, especially the board, that he wasn't backing down. The next few weeks were critical. But the more he thought about it, the more daunting the task seemed. He wasn't just fighting for control of Carter Innovations, he was fighting against an entire system, one that was built on old alliances, power dynamics, and, as he was beginning to realize, the deeply ingrained racism that still pervaded the corporate world. The days blurred into one another as the countdown to the board meeting began in earnest. David spent long hours at his desk, poring over reports, drafting proposals, and trying to anticipate every question the board might ask. His team was supportive, but even they couldn't hide the uncertainty in their eyes. They were loyal, yes, but they had seen what Victor could do. They had watched him manipulate situations, use his power to sway decisions, and twist narratives to his advantage. They were all too aware that a fight with Victor meant more than just winning, it meant surviving. Victor, on the other hand, made his presence felt in every meeting, every conversation. It wasn't enough for him to merely challenge David's ideas. He had to undermine him at every turn. David had never been someone to shy away from a challenge, but the weight of Victor's constant belittling was starting to take its toll. Every suggestion David made was met with skepticism. Every idea he put forward was shot down before it could even be fully explained. Victor didn't just want to win, he wanted to break David, to show the board and everyone else that David wasn't cut out for this job. His tactics were subtle at first, small, dismissive comments in meetings, questioning David's judgment in front of others, always just enough to plant seeds of doubt. But as the days went on, those comments grew sharper, more pointed. During one particularly tense strategy session, Victor had leaned across the table, his eyes cold and calculating. "I'm not sure your idea here is the right direction," he had said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe you should think about it some more, David. I'm sure your team can come up with something more reasonable." The board had watched in silence, their eyes flicking back and forth between David and Victor. The room felt like it was closing in on him. David had wanted to respond, to fire back with the same level of force that Victor always used. But he knew that doing so would only play into Victor's hands. If he lost his temper, if he let his emotions take over, it would give Victor all the ammunition he needed to portray David as unstable, unfit to lead. Instead, David kept his composure, leaning back in his chair. "I'm confident in my proposal, Victor. And I'm sure the board will see the potential in it once they've had the chance to review the details." His tone was calm, but inside, his blood was boiling. Victor's smirk was all too knowing. "We'll see," he said, before turning to the board members. The next few days were filled with similar exchanges. Each time David spoke up, Victor would find a way to deflect, dismiss, or diminish his input. It wasn't just about business anymore, it was about dominance. It was a game of power, and David could feel himself losing ground. As the board meeting approached, the pressure only increased. David spent late nights at the office, reviewing financials, refining his pitch, and rehearsing every possible argument he could make. But even as he prepared, the reality of the situation weighed heavily on him. The board was divided. Some respected his vision and the innovative work that David had led over the years. Others, however, had been loyal to Victor for far longer, and they were not easily swayed. David knew that Victor had allies on the board, old friends who had been with the company since its founding, who had helped shape its direction and its culture. These were the same people who had always supported the status quo, who believed in maintaining the hierarchy and keeping things the way they were. They didn't see David as part of that world. They saw him as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. David had never been one to back down, but now, with the board meeting looming, the stakes felt higher than ever. The decision they would make in that room would determine not only the future of Carter Innovations but David's future as well. If he couldn't secure enough votes, if he couldn't convince the board that he was the right person to lead the company, then he would be sidelined. The dream he had worked so hard for would be over. But what was more terrifying was the realization that this wasn't just about corporate strategy or business acumen anymore. It wasn't just about winning a fight for control. It was about something deeper. It was about proving to himself that he was worthy of the space he had fought to carve out for himself in a world that had never been built for him. As the days ticked down to the board meeting, David knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let Victor win. Not now. Not ever. Victor had underestimated him. And now, David was ready to make his move. David sat at the head of the conference table, his fingers drumming softly against the smooth wood, his mind racing with the pressure of the moment. Carter Innovations, his company, had been growing steadily for the last 5 years, but the pitch he was about to make to a group of potential investors could set the course for the next chapter of its success. He'd prepared for this moment for weeks, fine-tuning the numbers, revising projections, and perfecting his presentation. His team was behind him, confident and ready. It was, as he had often said to himself, his time. But now, as he looked across the table at Victor, his co-founder and sometimes adversary, David could already feel the tension rising. Victor's gaze was cold, his lips curled into a tight, dismissive smile. He was already in motion, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled like a man preparing for battle. David could feel the weight of the investors' eyes on him, could almost taste the opportunity that was slipping away by the second. But Victor, it seemed, was determined to push him into the corner. "David," Victor began, his voice dripping with condescension, "I think we need to be realistic here. This new project, this vision of yours, it's ambitious. But not in the way I think our investors are looking for. We've seen this approach before, and frankly, it hasn't worked." David felt his heart rate spike. He knew what was coming. Victor had been undermining him for months now, subtly at first, small jabs, snide remarks, suggestions that David wasn't suited for the kind of leadership Carter Innovations needed. But this was different. This was public, deliberate, and designed to make David look weak in front of the people who could determine the future of his company. Victor continued, eyes flicking over to the investors as if to ensure he had their full attention. David's ideas are, well, let's say, they're a little outside the box. His tone was dismissive. And maybe that's fine for someone with a vision. But when it comes down to actual execution, we need something more practical. More in line with what our investors can relate to. Not a lot of us came up with nothing and built this from the ground up, right? The room fell silent. David could feel the sting of the words, but what hurt the most was the implication Victor was playing on the stereotype that David had faced his entire life, the idea that he didn't belong at the table, that he didn't have the pedigree, the privilege, the right to lead. He could feel his jaw tighten, a bitter taste in the back of his throat. He fought to keep his composure. Victor had done this before, but this time was different. This time, David was no longer willing to let it slide. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him like a mantle. The room seemed to quiet even more, as if it, too, was waiting for what came next. "Victor," David said, his voice calm but firm, his words carrying the weight of years of frustration and determination. "I think we need to set the record straight." Victor raised an eyebrow, feigning indifference, but David saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "This company," David continued, "Carter Innovations, was not built on privilege. It wasn't built on the kind of luck you might think. It was built on hard work. On vision. And on sacrifice." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The investors were all eyes now, leaning forward, sensing the shift in the room. "My father didn't hand me a startup. My family didn't have connections. We didn't have access to the kinds of resources that others might have. But what we did have was grit. What we did have was an unwavering belief that we could make something from nothing." David's voice grew stronger, the words coming easier now, as if the pressure of the moment was unlocking something inside him. "You see, Victor, I didn't get here by following your rules. I didn't get here by playing it safe. I didn't get here by being what others thought I should be. I got here because I believed in something greater than what the world told me I could achieve. And that's why Carter Innovations is where it is today, not because of privilege or pedigree, but because of the work we've put in, the ideas we've pioneered, and the risks we've taken." He turned to the investors, locking eyes with each of them in turn. "You're looking for innovation, yes. For growth? Then you're looking at it? Because we're not just following trends, we're setting them. And if you're here to invest, I'm not asking for your approval. I'm asking you to join us in building the future." David's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. The words had flowed without hesitation, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, he realized something profound: he didn't need to ask for respect. He already had it. He had earned it. Victor, though clearly rattled, tried to regain his composure, his usual smug expression faltering for just a second before he masked it with a forced chuckle. "I think David's point is that no, Victor," David interrupted, his tone sharper than before. "My point is that you've underestimated what we've built here. You've underestimated the people in this room, my team, our investors, and me. And that's where you've gone wrong." He turned back to the table, facing the investors with a new kind of conviction. "Carter Innovations didn't get to where it is by taking the safe route. It got here because we believed in something bigger than just making money. We believed in creating a legacy. And I'm asking you, as investors, to believe in that with us." The room was silent for a beat, and then, one by one, the investors began to nod, some even exchanging glances that spoke volumes. David had spoken with authority, but more importantly, with honesty. He had told them the truth, not just about the company, but about himself. Victor opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He glanced at the investors, saw that the tide had shifted, and then looked back at David, a mixture of resentment and begrudging respect in his eyes. David didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The silence stretched for another moment before one of the investors, an older man with graying hair, cleared his throat and spoke up. "David, I believe you're right. I'm impressed by your vision and your leadership. This company has potential and we're here to back it. We're in." David nodded, the tension in his chest easing slightly. His eyes flicked to Victor, whose face had hardened in the aftermath of David's speech, but David knew the moment he had reclaimed his place at the table. "Thank you," David said, his voice steady. "I look forward to working together." As the investors began to discuss the next steps, David felt a sense of calm wash over him. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, replaced by something deeper, something more empowering. He had defended his vision, his company, and most importantly, himself. And in doing so, he had realized something crucial: he was no longer just fighting for respect. He was demanding it. For the first time in years, David felt like the leader he had always been meant to be. And the journey ahead, though uncertain, no longer felt as intimidating as it had before. He had taken control. And nothing would be the same after this moment. The air was thick with the weight of change, and David felt it in every corner of his office. The windows were now clear, sunlight streaming through them, but the light felt too bright, almost too harsh for the shadows that seemed to linger behind him. He could almost hear the hum of the city outside, the pulse of the corporate world, the rhythm of the game he was now deep in. It had been 2 weeks since the confrontation with Victor in the boardroom. 2 weeks since he had stood his ground, refusing to buckle under the pressure, daring to challenge the power that had long been a staple of the company's old guard. His position was more secure now. The board, after an agonizing period of indecision, had finally come around to his side. They understood that David's leadership was crucial for the company's future, and in the volatile landscape of their industry, stability, real, forward-thinking leadership was more important than any personal feud or tradition. The headlines had shifted, too. No longer was David the uncertain outsider. The media had picked up on the brewing tension between him and Victor, framing it as a battle for the soul of the company, a battle against systemic forces of racism and a push for progress. They painted David as a leader who refused to be silenced, someone who would stand up against the subtle forces trying to push him down. His face began to appear more frequently in articles and interviews, his name alongside terms like change, resilience, and determination. But the attention wasn't entirely welcome. The praises of the press, while flattering, only added to the pressure he felt to deliver. And worse, Victor wasn't done. The man's influence didn't evaporate with a few lost votes in the boardroom. Far from it. In fact, it seemed as if Victor had only intensified his efforts to undermine David at every turn. Victor's loyalists still lurked in the shadows of the company. Those who had been quietly in his corner, senior managers, key influencers, weren't ready to abandon ship. Victor made sure that his voice was still heard in every department, every meeting, and even in the casual conversations among employees. While David was busy focusing on steering the ship forward, Victor's silent campaign of sabotage continued, undercutting decisions, questioning David's every move, quietly reassuring those on the fence that his way, Victor's way, was the only way to ensure the company's survival. David could feel it. The whisper campaigns. The snide remarks. He knew Victor wasn't just playing for his position, he was playing for David's failure. And David couldn't ignore it. He wasn't one to shrink from a fight, but this was a war on many fronts: personal, professional, and public. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his reverie. A message from his wife, Claire. "How's everything going? You okay?" The question, simple as it seemed, hit harder than he expected. He hadn't really had the time to stop and reflect on how his personal life had been affected in the wake of everything. His focus had shifted so completely to the corporate battle that he had barely spoken to Claire, let alone spent any quality time with her. She had been his rock for so long, but even she couldn't weather the storm of his consuming ambition indefinitely. David ran a hand through his hair, staring at the phone for a long moment. He had been avoiding their conversations, but now he felt the weight of that avoidance more than ever. He knew he had been distant, tuning out her concerns, the late-night phone calls where she would ask him how his day had gone, only to receive a vague answer as he retreated into the demands of his job. The pressure of holding onto his position had turned him into a man he hardly recognized. He typed a quick reply, "I'm fine. Just busy. Let's talk tonight." That was all he could manage before pushing the phone away. He had no time to deal with the emotional costs right now. There was too much at stake. Too many people watching. Too many pieces in motion. But as the days passed, the weight of the situation began to settle deeper into his bones. The meetings grew longer, the decisions more critical. The board had given him more control, yes, but with that came expectations that were now too heavy to ignore. He had to prove himself every single day. And that was where it started to get complicated, because it wasn't just the company he had to fight for anymore. It was also for himself. The next board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, and David could feel the anxiety brewing in his chest as he entered the room. He had already seen the new reports on his desk: quarterly projections, market analysis, and a damning performance review of one of his key departments. They were all minor setbacks, the kind of issues that could have been resolved with a few quick decisions, but with the growing tensions around him, even the smallest problems felt like catastrophes waiting to happen. David sat at the head of the table, his eyes flicking to Victor, who was sitting across from him. Victor's smile was tight, controlled, but David could feel the coldness that lingered between them. It was the same silent challenge, the same unspoken message: "You might have won this round, but I'm not out yet." The meeting began, and David led the discussion, as usual. But today, his nerves were on edge. He could feel Victor's presence like a shadow, pushing back on every decision, every suggestion. He was waiting for a moment to pounce. And when it came, it was sudden. "I don't think David's proposed changes are enough to ensure we stay competitive," Victor said, his voice smooth and calm, as always. "We need a more aggressive approach. More than just tweaking things. If we want to secure our future, we need to consider broader, riskier moves." David's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. He had learned long ago that Victor's style was subtle, always calculated. He wasn't going to fall into that trap. Not this time. "Those riskier moves have already been considered," David responded, his voice steady but firm. "What we need now is stability. We can't gamble with the company's future when we've just started to recover from the last round of risks. It's not the right time." Victor didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed. "Stability isn't going to get us ahead in this market, David. You know that." "I know exactly what I'm doing," David said, his voice cutting through the tension. "And if you trust me, you'll see it in the results." The room fell silent. It was a standoff, one that had become too familiar. David wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything. The board members exchanged looks, murmuring among themselves. David could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. The unspoken challenge was clear: if he couldn't deliver, the internal conflict would consume the company. And Victor would be waiting to take the reins. By the time the meeting ended, David had regained his composure, but the battle was far from over. It wasn't just about what happened in the boardroom, it was everything else that hung in the balance. His family. His friends. The relentless tension between his personal life and professional demands was starting to take its toll. That evening, when he finally made it home, he found Claire waiting for him at the kitchen table. She was quiet, eyes tracing the rim of her coffee cup, but there was a sadness in her expression. She didn't say anything right away, but David could feel her disappointment hanging in the air. "I've been trying to reach you all day," she said softly, her voice tired. "David, we need to talk. I know you're busy with work, but we can't keep living like this." David sank into the chair opposite her, rubbing his eyes. "I know, Claire. I'm sorry. It's just, there's so much at stake right now." "I know," she said, her voice cracking. "But you're not just losing yourself in this fight, David. You're losing us." David looked at her, his heart tightening. She was right. He had become so consumed by proving himself that he had neglected the very people who had always stood by him. The company, the fight against Victor, it had become all-consuming. And in the process, he had almost lost the thing that mattered most. "I'll fix this, Claire," he whispered. "I promise." But as he spoke, he wondered, could he really balance it all? Or was this fight going to destroy everything he cared about in the process? The battle for the company had only just begun, but David was starting to realize that the stakes were higher than he ever imagined. The boardroom had never felt so suffocating. David sat at the head of the long, polished table, his fingers drumming anxiously against the surface as his mind raced. Outside, the world seemed calm, but inside the walls of the company, the war for control had become all-consuming. Victor and his growing faction had successfully begun to twist the narrative, painting David as a weak, indecisive leader unfit to steer the company toward its future. It started with whispers, small, almost imperceptible rumors passed along by employees, executives, and even clients. At first, it was about David's leadership style: too distant, too hands-off, not a true visionary. As the weeks wore on, these whispers grew louder and more malicious. It wasn't long before the public face of the company David himself was being painted as a man out of touch with the realities of running a business, a man unable to keep up with the changing tides of the industry. Every day felt like a new assault, a new lie to untangle. The worst part was that it was working. Clients began pulling back. Investors, once loyal to David's vision, started expressing concern. Even some of the senior staff who had once been his strongest allies were beginning to question their allegiance. There was a chasm forming, slowly widening beneath David's feet, and he could feel it, even when he tried to ignore it. Victor's voice had become the one that rang loudest in the halls of the company. "David's leadership is outdated," he would say in interviews. "His approach is a relic of the past. If we want to survive, we need a leader who understands what's coming."